Good morning. We are about to start. Thank you so much for joining us today in this event on No Climate Justice Without Civic Space and Human Rights, co-organized by 350.org, the Center for International Environmental Law, and Amnesty International. So we know that you're very busy, all different schedules, so thank you so much for being here. It's a very important topic linking how civic space is important for climate action in all countries and within this space in the UNFCCC processes, and so what we need to do to address challenges that we are facing. So I want to thank you all for coming, but also all our panelists here today. And just want to set a bit the context for this event. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Chiara Liguori from Amnesty International and working on climate justice. And so the context for today is that civic space is essential for climate action. And what is civic space? It's basically, civic space is an enabling environment in which we can all express ourselves freely. We can join associations and join others in peaceful protests, for example. And so this is essential in climate action because we all know the urgency that we are facing, the fears that we are, and the distress that people are facing, and the loss and damage that are there. And so we really need to be able to mobilize, to express dissent when decisions that are made are not up to standards, are not what we need to face this urgency. We need to be able to get together and really participate in decision-making processes. But in many contexts, this is not possible. We have, in certain countries, this civic space is basically very restricted because of laws that ban protests or restrictions that are put in place, for example, even intimidation and arrests of these dissidents, but also in contexts that were traditionally more open to the expression of freedom of expression and so on, are now being restricted, for example, in many global north countries. And in many cases, climate protesters and climate defenders are specifically targeted. And the UNFCCC is a space where we should be able to participate and really make ourselves heard. But in many cases, we are also facing hurdles in this space. And there are some structural complications, right? Because of already organizations need to be accredited to be able to participate. And this is a long, burdensome process that can take a long time. And then once there is accreditation, then you have to get visas and funding. And often visas are denied. And so it puts a burden on people, especially from the global south and so on. And once all this is resolved, still we are facing restrictions in this UNFCCC context. So, for example, in Katowice, in Poland, there were people who were arrested for no legitimate reasons or denied entry. In Glasgow, we faced restrictions to accessing negotiations rooms. And then another level of complications last year in Egypt, where there were difficulties in registering participants. There was an untransparent registration process for participants, national participants, and then people were arrested because before COP, because in relation to calls for protests, and then inside COP there were instances of harassment and intimidation of participants and observers. And so we are facing the similar situation in the UAE this year, given the national context, and we'll hear more from our colleague and panelist, Hamad. And so really, at the same time, while we're facing these restrictions of civic space, there is other actually voice given in a disproportionately manner to representatives of fossil fuel interests. And so this creates a strong imbalance between those who are there to advance a just climate action, who are restricted in their participation, and on the other hand, those who are actually undermining climate action, who have a free pass. And so here today we are here to hear from our panelists on these topics from different perspectives, from a national government perspective, but also from other colleagues from civil society and indigenous peoples. And so without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our panelists. The first one is Camila Cepeda, head of the Mexican delegation. Thank you, Camila.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for having us here. And I mean, it's very surprising that at this stage of time, we're still arguing for human rights to be respected, even that all of national parties have upheld the Human Rights Charter, and that in all of other conventions, it's somewhat a given. It's quite surprising that we still have to face in this time surveillance and harassment and intimidation and sexual harassment. And it's just appalling that we still have to keep that fight. And what surprised me the most is that you would think that a lot of countries that are normally very vocal about it, here they stand quiet. And I don't know what the politics are behind. I'm not a diplomatic person, even if I'm like a head of delegation. I tend to speak out. But usually what happens is that our Mexican delegation, which is comprised mostly by young female delegates, by civil society members, by indigenous people representatives, I actually have Emilia here from civil society that's part of the delegation, which a lot of you know, and also Beatriz, who's a youth representative from indigenous peoples. So we end up being the only ones left in the room, and we're left alone, holding this battle against like these very powerful men, I would say mostly. And it's very frustrating that even as a country, and we speak up and we defend the civic space, and we defend the participation of observers, and we defend human rights to its core, we're being left alone in many negotiation rooms across finance, across loss and damage, across adaptation, across now the institutional arrangements meeting. We were part of sort of the many that had to suffer quite a difficult experience in COP27. We made official complaints. Imagine, as a head of delegation, with non-verbals, with all that entangles like a government, we made official complaints on all of these situations that were happening, and we were not addressed, and we were not taken care of. I can't even imagine what it is like observers that don't even have a government behind them. So that's completely unacceptable, and that's why on these SB sessions as Mexico, we've taken up to our hands to make sure that host agreements going forward do reflect that there needs to be accountability, that there needs to protect the dignity and the privacy and the security of all participants, including the right to free assembly, free speech, and that situations of harassment, sexual harassment, intimidation, reprisals, all of these things are not allowed, and that there is some kind of mechanism to address. We're still holding sort of the new meeting with the Secretariat. We've even gone to the Executive Secretariat with this request, and we have proposed language to make sure that those host agreements are also public and transparent, and that they uphold UN principles and international human rights law to make sure that we are guaranteeing a safe space. And it's not just words, but that in practice, I mean, that there is a change in behavior, because some answers I've got when I complain is, well, there's sexual harassment all over the world. I've heard this from a party after I speak up, and I'm a head of delegation. So what, am I going to take for granted that because I get sexually harassed all over the world, then it's okay for me to get sexually harassed here? It's just absolutely ridiculous. We can't allow, in an UN conference where we're supposed to have, UN principles, these situations anymore. And so we need more voices. As I mentioned, we usually get left out in the room by ourselves. But in that sense, I will ask you, I'm guessing that most people here are observers. I don't know if there are many parties, but thank you, party over there. But I would ask you to also support us in the room, because we need more loud people coming into and asking and demanding, because if we're not heard, then we're just undermined, and that can't happen. And we will keep pushing for it. You've seen, I think, all of you, that Mexico consistently in every multilateral forum asks for those references on human rights, then continues to fight for them until the last minute. It's a red flag for us, but we can't be alone in the room. That would just not work, because again, I get very stark responses as the ones I've mentioned, and like right here, like I'm still hearing those kind of says like, oh, this is how the world works, like just get over it. It's not possible, and we need to change that, and we need to make sure that for COP28 we have a safe and secure space. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Camila. Quite striking that what you had to go through, especially as you said, if as a head of delegation you are facing these difficulties, observers are really in a much worse situation. But we are, at the same time, this is why we are here, is also because we don't want you to be alone in the room to raise these issues. And so as civil society, we are doing our best to mobilize and request parties that they take these issues seriously in these processes. And so maybe just a particular question as a follow-up in terms of thanks for the efforts you're making, and how do you see things progressing and the possibility of publishing the host agreements this year and in future years is, if you can maybe tell us what needs to be done specifically on this point.
Yeah, so we have proposed language, so it includes human rights safeguards. We have yet to hear. There will be a meeting tomorrow, Wednesday. They haven't released the schedule, but tomorrow, Wednesday, the Secretariat will be informing us sort of the process and what it entails. I know that they have yet to sign the host agreement with the Emirates, so there's still room to put pressure to make sure that at least I can't understand that there are some confidential clauses in financial terms that would not be able to be disclosed, but at least all of these safeguards would need to be public. And that's something that we can put pressure on it before the ESB sessions. Keep asking for it, keep asking the Secretariat, keep asking the incoming presidency, and that we still have an opportunity not just for future host agreements, but the one that we will have immediately next. So, I would suggest also that a lot of you could go to the arrangements for intergovernmental meetings AM tomorrow, Wednesday, sometime, because that's where the Secretariat will let us know, and we'll see the new text. I don't know if our submissions have been taken into consideration, so again, make some noise there.
Thank you so much. And so now I would like to give the floor to Hamad Al-Shamsi, who is from the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center, and is a human rights defender in exile since 2012. So without further ado, thank you, Ahmad.
Yeah, thank you, Yara, for this. My name is Hamad Al-Shamsi. And it is I am very honored to be here and to speak in front of you about the situation in the Emirates and the human rights situation in the Emirates. I assume that most of you are going to attend and participate in COP28 in Dubai next November. However, many Emirates Emirati activists, Emirati human rights defenders, Emiratis prisoners of conscience will not be able to participate because they are already in jail. As I speak to you right now, there are more than 60 documented cases of prisoners of conscience, and I would like to underline the word documented because I believe that the number is way more than the 60. But just for limitation reasons, we cannot document all of the other cases. As I speak to you right now, there are more than 51 prisoners of conscience in detention beyond their sentence. They have completed their sentences years ago, but they're still in detention. And some of them has completed almost 6 years. I'll give you an example here. Abdullah Al-Hulu, one of the detainees, he was detained in 2014. He was sentenced to 3 years in a prison. He served the 3 years in 2017, but he's still in prison, like 6 years beyond his sentence, and he's still in prison. Abdullah Al-Hulu is not alone. A lot of other prisoners of conscience in detention beyond their sentences. For example, Dr. Muhammad Al-Rakan, he is very prominent human rights defenders. He's still in prison beyond his sentence. He completed his sentence 1 year ago, but he's still in detention. A lot of other people beyond their sentences, Dr. Sultan bin Qaid al-Qasimi, Dr. Muhammad al-Mansouri, Khalifa Rabi'a, and a lot of other names, and most of them are prominent human rights defenders, activists in the UAE. Most of the people in detention, they have completed almost 10 years in prisons, but they're still in prison. Maybe someone would ask, why? Why do we have prisoners of conscience in the UAE? And I think the simple answer is because of the absence of civic space. In the UAE, we do not have a civic space. We do not have a civic space, absolutely. It is like 0% civic space. You cannot speak freely. You cannot form your own association. You cannot criticize your government. And you cannot even criticize other government. Like if that other government is a friend of the UAE government. I'll give you an example. Dr. Nasser bin Ghaith, he was detained in 2015. Why he was detained? Because he tweeted in a way that he criticized the Egyptian regime. 2 days later, he was detained and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, only because of that. Not only him, Ahmed Al-Utum is a Jordanian. He was in UAE, unfortunately. And he criticized his own government while he was in UAE. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Some of my friends told me from Jordan, if Ahmed Al-Utum, he's a Jordanian, if he was in Jordan and he criticized the Jordan regime while he was in Jordan, he will not be sentenced more than 2 years. But unfortunately, he was in the UAE and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and he's still in prison. Having said that, I would like to move to other subject, which is the systematic torture. In UAE, torture became part of the system. It is systematic. That means the cases that I'm going to mention, or I have mentioned, they are not isolated. It became part of the system. Every prisoner of conscience has to go through the same procedures. Every prisoner of conscience has to be detained in solitary confinement, has to be detained in facility managed by the state security apparatus themselves. And it is unfortunately according to the law. There was a law published in 2003. The name of the law is the State Security Apparatus Law. In one of its articles, it says clearly that state security apparatus can detain anyone in the UAE for 90 days without even notifying the public prosecution. So the public prosecutor will not know that there is someone being detained somewhere in the UAE for 90 days. And they can extend it. They can extend it after they get, I cannot say after getting permission from public prosecution, but after notifying the public prosecution. So, and eventually this period, the detainee will stay in a state security apparatus facility. And in the state security apparatus facilities, people being subjected to many different kinds of tortures. And this is system. Everyone has to go through this. And solitary confinement is the least. And nowadays in UAE, they do not consider solitary confinement as a torture. They're saying it is only solitary confinement. What's wrong with that? I mean, so the notion of torture, changed within the UAE. So solitary confinement, they do not consider it as a torture because everyone has to go through the same system. And plus, a lot of other documented cases, we know that a lot of people has been beaten, a lot of people, like 24-hour lightning, 24-hour cold weather, day and night interrogation. These kind of torture happening inside the UAE. And these are not, as I mentioned, they are not isolated cases. Yeah, I would like to move to other subject, which is collective punishment. Unfortunately, the UAE government is very good at collective punishment. When they detain someone, they are punishing someone. At the same time, they are punishing his family. And the least they do to his family to put them on travel ban. So this is the least. And also, it is ridiculous. They're saying, okay, what's wrong of being in UAE? Why do you need to travel? Stay in UAE. This is what they're saying. Like I have a detainee. One of my relatives is a detainee, and his wife cannot travel just because she's his wife. She cannot leave the country. This is the least. But they go further and withdraw citizenship of families of the detainees. And nowadays, unfortunately, withdrawing a citizenship of a UAE national is easier than firing an employee. When you fire an employee, you will send him a warning and you will give him like 15 days to settle himself. But in UAE, you will get a phone call saying, you know what, you are no longer a UAE citizen. Come back to our immigration office, hand in your IDs, your passport, everything. And when you are without ID in UAE, that means you are without an identity. You cannot go to the bank and withdraw your money. You cannot drive your car. You cannot do anything inside the UAE. And this has happened a lot in the UAE. And I will give you one example here. And this is the example of one of the detainees. His name is Abdussalam Darwish al-Marzouki. He completed his sentence 1 year ago, but his family could escape the UAE in 2016. So they went to the US. They currently in the US, they are applying for asylum in the US. And he has 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons. And 2 daughters and the 3 sons and the wife could escape. So they are currently in the USA. 1 year later, I forgot to mention this. The 3 sons, actually, they have some psychological problems and they are going into medication in the US. And the UAE government was paying for this. And one year later, they get a call saying, okay, you know what? You are no longer a UAE citizen. You need to come back to the UAE, bring your passport, or you hand it to the embassy. So, and they stopped the paying for the medication of the family. And one of the sons passed away just 1 year ago. And you just can imagine now the situation. The father in detention, one of his daughter in the UAE, she cannot leave the country because she has no IDs, and the rest of the family in the US are applying for asylum seekers, for asylums in the US. So this is the situation, and this is one of the families. Like some of these people are just under 18, like 12 years old, 10 years old, 8 years old. So they are children, but without a citizenship because they withdraw the citizenship. Not only him, Imran Radwan is the same. Mahmoud al-Husari, the same situation, Muhammad al-Siddiq, a lot of other people, they have been stripped from their citizenship because just of their activism while they are in the UAE. I think if I'll keep going giving examples, I will not finish because a lot of examples can be said in here. But to conclude, I think in order for the UAE to be eligible to host international events such as COP28, such as Expo, other things. It is good to have them in my country. However, I think we should have an open space, an open civic space. And without open civic space, we cannot, do any pressure against the government to do what we think is right. And to open this civic space, I believe that the UAE must release all prisoners of conscience, especially whose finished and served their sentences, and also to amend some laws and articles in these laws that, limit the freedom of expression, forming association, and also I believe that all state securities facilities, prisons, must be closed. We should not have any secret prisons inside the UAE to have a free, just, open civic space. Yeah, I will stop here, and thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Hamad. I think this is a very important testimony, and I'm so glad that you were here and able to be with us today and explain to us the hardships that human rights defenders face in the UAE. It's important for us to know, and you have also highlighted what the government should be doing to really release prisoners of conscience and the steps that they need to take to ease up and free the civic space that is needed in the country. And this is a human rights obligation, but it is also needed ahead of COP to be able to have a conference that really delivers on what is urgently needed. So yes, now I would like to move to another speaker, Thomas Joseph, from the Hopa Valley Tribal Member and Indigenous Environmental Network. And Thomas, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Joseph. I am a Hopa Valley Tribal Member, which is now it's located in the Six Rivers National Forest of what's now called California. I come from the belly of the beast. I am the I work with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And when I speak of the belly of the beast, I'm speaking that my community lives within the fourth largest world's economy, which is also within the United States, which is the world's largest economy. And so when we talk about corporate capture, we have firsthand experience of seeing how corporate capture has affected civil society, and how we see that civil society is essential for climate action, and so is equity. And so when we see this corporate capture on our lands, it looks like our traditional ecological knowledge being used for profitable gain. It looks like the management of our ancestral lands how we used to manage our lands and manicure our lands, now being commodified. And so when we look at the belly of the beast, we see that all of the major human rights steps towards a more humane society started through civil disobedience, started through people realizing that they needed to push back and engage outside the normal methods of governments. We know that with these colonial nations that the power really does reside within the people, and that this space needs to be allowed and needs to be created. We would not have so-called equal rights in the United States if it wasn't without civil engagement. We would not have equality for women to be able to vote without civic engagement. And so the importance of civic engagement is deeply embedded in a step towards a greater humanity. And I really appreciate coming into these types of spaces where we can start to build the world that we see as just. And it's not built within these negotiation spaces, but it's built through civil society. And when we see how in these negotiation spaces and how COP tries to reach its civil society within its own parties, within its own nations, to portray a picture that they are addressing climate change, that they have solutions for climate change. And it causes civil society to relax a little bit and think that they don't need to engage. But I'm here to say we need to engage, and those spaces need to become more available so that we can prepare for those 7 generations down the road, how us Indigenous people have seen things. I come from a society that has been matriarchal-led since time immemorial. Our people for thousands of years have practiced the importance of women leadership. And when we come into these colonial spaces, we see how that voice is hidden down, is sometimes even buried. I want to also thank the Camelia from the delegation of Mexico for raising those issues of patriarchy. Because when we resolve climate solutions based on patriarchy, then it's not the full picture. And we do see how patriarchy is led in a way to silence people. And they see civic society as a threat because it's not a normal power structure that they're used to. And so living within the belly of the beast, we have many examples how our people have been incarcerated and held without their will, even with court cases that are in their favor. As of a few days ago, we had elderly indigenous women arrested for their civic engagement of trying to stop a lithium mine on their sacred sites in Nevada. And so when we understand that this method of patriarchy also needs to be addressed when we're trying to resolve climate issues, it's because we need a different thought process. We need the collective, and we can't have the collective without the engagement of civil society. It is a concern of mine for our brothers and sisters that want to attend COP28 that self-identify as the LGBTQ community. I have colleagues that didn't go to COP27 because of their fear and their concerns. And so when we're looking for a just transition, when the world is coming together to find resolve for climate change, we have to understand that some of those greatest thought patterns, some of those greatest ideas will come from people that are outside the norm, will come from people that have experienced a just transition or an unjust transition themselves. And so that space does need to be created. We do need to recognize the importance of the collective. And society will not do that without civil engagement. That is the pathway forward. And so as an indigenous person, it's hard to be so critical and to be so, and to address these issues in the same manner of also withholding your cultural values. The COP28 is going to be hosted by the United Arab Emirates, and they are the host. Now, I know how it feels to go into a country when others come into a country and don't respect the host. I know how it feels when others come into a country and push their values and their ideals on you. And so it is important for us as indigenous people to also stay true to our values and acknowledge that they are the host, but yet we have critiques. Yet we have a desire to make sure that space is created for all of us, to make sure that the delegation that we're bringing is respected and is honored and doesn't have to experience some of the things that Camelia said from the Mexico delegation. You know, that is hurtful. I mean, we are in a moment in time where we must come together and where civic engagement is probably one of the most fundamental things that is needed in this space. We have seen how actions in COP27 all had to be inside these barriers, these walls. You know, when we're looking for a voice of the people, let the people speak. Let those demands be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I don't think anybody could have said in best words really the power of the collective, and everybody needs to be included. And I really liked when you said the greatest thoughts and ideas come from people outside the norms, because and so we really need to make space and make sure that it's the COPs and other UNFCCC processes are inclusive, but in reality, not just on paper. Well, sometimes we hear these pledges that it's going to be the most inclusive COPs, and I think many different presidencies have done that, but we are yet to see that. So as a final speaker, I would like to hand over to Catherine Robinson, who is Head of Campaigns and Natural Justice, working with communities and defenders in Africa, and using and shaping human rights and environmental law.
Thanks so much to all the other speakers, and thanks for the invitation. And yeah, solidarity to all the other speakers on all the issues that you've raised. So it goes without saying that civil society plays a vital contribution to multilateralism. We know very well that the most important achievements of multilateralism would not exist without the sustained contributions from movements, from civil society. And civil society has long been the driving force behind many of the ideals that are enshrined in multilateralism. The IPCC, in its 1.5 degree special report, described civil society as, to a great extent, the only reliable motor for driving institutions to change at the pace required. So I want to zoom out a little bit. We've zoomed into civic participation at the UNFCCC spaces, but I do want to zoom out and think about and encourage us to think about the crisis of multilateralism more broadly. What's happening at the UNFCCC, unchecked corporate power, shrinkage of civic space, and the shrinking of both policy and fiscal space is not an abstraction, but it's an increasing entrenchment of corporate capture and private interests in the developmental and human rights spaces across the UN system and across all multilateral spaces. This move towards multi-stakeholderism has led to a crisis in multilateralism and is rolling back hard-won rights at the expense of civil society, movements, observers, constituencies, and of course communities who are most impacted by and are the most vulnerable to rights violations and most impacted by the weak and regressive decisions that are made in these spaces. So although there is increased public scrutiny of the UN climate meetings and the negotiations continue to lag behind and urgent action is stalled. And one of the reasons for this is that state parties to the UNFCCC have not created a conflict of interest policy that could potentially regulate the influence of delegates with conflicts of interest on negotiations. We know very well that fossil fuel companies continue to openly participate in COP meetings, both as delegates and the financial sponsors of some of the most recent COPs, Chile, Spain, Poland. And the lobbying efforts of some of the biggest historic emitters, BP, Shell, Chevron, have helped contribute to an increasingly voluntary nature of the international climate framework, which also explains why there is an increase in climate litigation in various jurisdictions. In 2019, COP25, the US government delegation attempted to expand a loophole that would have potentially expanded protections for governments and companies from being held liable for climate change and loss and damage compensation to countries on the front line of the crisis. Fossil fuel companies are not the only entities creating climate crisis. Large multinational agriculture companies are often part of the negotiations related to agriculture. And then you compare that to the smallholder farmers who've contributed the least to climate change but bear the brunt of the crisis, particularly women farmers from the global south. So in the longer term, what needs to change? The obvious answer is that corporations should not be involved with UN bodies or the Secretariat because of the conflict of interest with the United Nations goals and objectives. Their involvement undermines the mandate of the UN as an independent, impartial, and effective multilateral body, particularly in relation to the protection and promotion of human rights. And this involvement of corporates is weakening and compromising the UN's ability to hold corporates to account. Just to reiterate that the preamble of the Charter of the UN starts with the words, "We are the peoples of the United Nations." The UN should live up to its founding mission of being a forum for people's representation and a protector of their universal rights and interests. Now more than ever, we need to democratize global governance and bolster international cooperation that builds on the collective efforts of citizens, particularly women, young people, indigenous people, who are at the forefront of the global efforts to care for people and planet. We do need clearer strategies to counter elite, corporate, and right-wing threats to multilateralism, including nationalism and authoritarianism. This shrinkage of space within the multilateral system and this corporate power, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. It both mirrors and exacerbates national-level shrinkages. We are seeing increasingly state capture and usurping of state and use of state machinery and resources to criminalize and repress civil society resistance in order to protect right-wing interests and corporate profits, which we see playing out in the host countries. So, for example, in Madrid, we've touched on some of the examples in previous COPs. In Madrid, in and outside the UNFCCC venue, there was harassment, repression, harassment of youth activists, indigenous people, women. People were debadged, and during protests, most observers were marched out by the Spanish police with, automatic weapons. Glasgow was dubbed one of the most male-dominated, greenwashed, and exclusionary COPs. There was a lot of policing of multiple actions and demonstrations. There were reports of kettling, misuse of power, threats of arrest. And this is while activists were demanding the right to protest and voice their concerns about the climate emergency. And we've touched on Egypt, problematic human rights record, limitation on civic and political rights, reports of surveillance, intimidation, arbitrary arrest, sexual harassment, both of observers and parties. And like our comrade said, there was very little space on the outside of COP for civil society to mobilize and organize and strategize. And Ahmed, you've made it very clear what the concerns are at the UAE, and this. The limitations on human rights and restrictions on freedom of assembly and expression, arbitrary detention, it creates justified fears among those planning to attend and planning around COP28. And how can civil society, truly register resistance to corporate power and to call for polluters to be kicked out when the UAE is one of the world's largest oil producers and, of course, is presided over by an oil executive. We've even seen it play out here at Bonn when civil society actions last week were banned with the upcoming presidency arriving in Bonn. That was overturned, but it's already happening. So civil society at this SB, in the more immediate terms, have put together a list of demands for parties to ensure and protect civic space and public participation at upcoming UNFCCC processes. One is to affirm publicly at the SB 58 the expectation of governments that public participation and civic space be fully protected without discrimination from interference in the context of all UNFCCC processes. So this includes COP28, and it calls upon the current and upcoming presidencies at the UNFCCC Secretariat to guarantee safe an enabling environment for human rights defenders, environmental defenders, women, indigenous peoples, and civil society organizations. There's a call to engage with the UAE to insist on meaningful improvements in the human rights situation in the UAE ahead of COP28, particularly the release of arbitrarily detained activists. and to repeal repressive laws limiting civic and political rights, particularly those that discriminate against women, queer people, and marginalized groups. Also urging Egypt, the current COP27 president, to abide by its international human rights obligations, to release arbitrarily detained protesters, particularly those that were engaged in peaceful protests around COP. Thirdly, to insist that the UNFCCC Secretariat take proactive steps to fulfill its duty to protect the safety of all participants in the UNFCCC processes. So one is to develop clear human rights standards and principles to be included in host country agreements and make sure those agreements are both public and transparent. And also establish a focal point for reprisals and cooperate with other UN agencies to facilitate redress. Reiterate that the effective protection of the rights of access to information, public participation, and access to remedy is a prerequisite for any ambitious climate action. Denounce all instances of reprisals and acts of intimidation against participants in the UNFCCC meetings, and ensure that supporting civil society's participation in global climate decision-making is a foreign policy priority, including efforts to protect environmental and human rights defenders as well as climate activists. And just to close, the Secretariat and member states must ensure that the UNFCCC space continues to serve the people and the environment through meaningful, inclusive, and representative participation. And if governments really are serious about addressing the root causes of intersecting global crises, including the climate crisis, we need to build multilateral institutions that are democratic, representative, and participative. And just a final call to civil society and observers, we really need to ramp up efforts to reclaim and transform multilateralism and to advance a people's multilateralism that is fit for people and planet and that redistributes wealth and power, takes into account historical responsibility, and puts human rights, environmental, social, and gender justice at its center. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I think you've done a brilliant job in giving us a picture of what is needed, from a different level. So, like to make sure that the fossil fuels and other powerful interests are not, limiting and taking over negotiations and dictating what is decided, but also to make sure that those who really have experiences and important stories to share and can participate and can effectively be heard and the center of these processes. I think now we can open up for questions from the audience. And just before, I wanted to let you know that the filming there is from Human Rights Watch. So in case anybody has any issue with that, let us know. But without that, after that, I would like to open the floor and for any interventions and questions. Please. You in first, yeah.
Oh, is there a mic or do I just speak?
Oh.
I can just speak. Okay, so I'm also a professor of gender, sexuality, and women's study. I've also been active in the labor movement. I was a former labor researcher in one of the largest public sector unions in Alberta, and I'm a former labor advisor for the Government of Canada. And so when an Indigenous organization asked me to review the UN policy on harassment and discrimination at the last COP, I was kind of surprised at how weak it was, how it doesn't seem like there's much natural justice within it, the system, and that it gives a lot of power to the UN. So I actually advised them, like, I would not file a complaint unless it was like a very serious complaint, because I've spent my life reading collective agreements and legal language on harassment and discrimination, and it just seemed very weak to me. Also, as an Indigenous woman who's traveled to 4 different COP venues, I've faced like sexual harassment and discrimination. I do have recourse through my employer, but what would that even do, right? And so at Bonn, I've actually brought a male relative to travel with me. And I'm thinking if I go to the UAE, I would have to bring my husband. But my husband is a black man as well, who's active in labor. So would we just not come? So I really hope that they do improve their policies, because I've read so many collective agreement and corporate policies from different governments on harassment and discrimination, and this organization has a weak policy. And I would also say that I've just written a book called The End of This World on calling for a decolonial feminist just transition, because corporations have too much power in Canada. I was part of a large study, 7-year study called the Corporate Mapping Project, looking at the political power of oil in Canada. And it was funded by the federal government, but our provincial government came after us for doing this project. So all of these powers of colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy are working against us, especially as Indigenous women. And it's hard to be in these spaces because we know we have so little power, and corporations have so much power that is now melded together with our nation states. So I agree that we should have more civil space and civil engagement, but the power imbalance is so wide that it saddens me. That's it. I have no questions, but I would like to follow up and find out what happens in your situation in the future.
Thank you. Maybe let's take the questions there and then allow the panel to respond. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much to all of you. My question or suggestion is very much in keeping with what all of you have said, but I so agree with Catherine. We do have a crisis in multilateralism, and I think one of the impacts of that is there are no clear spaces for representation and inclusion from civil society that can speak to the climate impacts. It's taken us a really long time to get to a place where we can speak about human impacts and human beings in a conversation that for too many decades has been rather scientific and esoteric, right? I know of a number of very good actors in the civil society space that are not here today because of visa regimes. And it seems to me that as a person of color, but is privileged by living in the global north, maybe there are some actions we need to take to stand in solidarity with so many of our colleagues and comrades in the global south, especially Africa and Asia, but not only, right, that are just not here at the SBs. And then what do we say for COP? And as a person who has lived in the global south and have many family members who constantly can't even go on a holiday without butting up against externalization of borders and border regimes, this is paramount that we in civil society, take collective action to say that this is unacceptable. I know of one person that's only arriving, will be able to attend only today because of how long the fight has been, even last week, to, protest against the denial of visas. So it's not just the COPs, it's CSBs, it's all the civic space that I think we need to be a bit more engaged upon. So I'd love to ask or encourage or welcome. I know climate refugees would certainly be down to support any efforts. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we take other questions, maybe let's see if the panelists want to say anything about this. Any reflections?
Just with the comment before on how the UN language is very weak. Yes, it's surprisingly very weak, and because every change would need to go through consensus, and you can imagine that it's pretty tough to get it through. So there is a code of conduct, but still very weak. So my process of learning through these governmental meetings is that if you go through the institutional channels, then nothing gets solved. But they do care about the reputation. And so going to press and making sort of a fuss with other colleagues is the only one thing that works. And it happens that whenever I actually go to like European heads of delegation, the US heads of delegation, the like more geopolitical big forces, and that I get the support, all of a sudden now I'm listened to. So yeah, it's unfortunately, but it's not through the process that you can solve things as of today.
Thank you. I would just like to add just 2 quick notes pertaining to the 2 comments that were made. As long as we continue to make a foundation built on what has caused climate crisis, which is capitalism and colonialism, and heavily embedded with patriarchy, we are going to continue to experience these types of outcomes. And so it's really up to civil society to not only engage with COP, but within their countries as well, to understand the importance of decolonization, to really grasp the importance of addressing patriarchy, and addressing our parties in that same manner, that those systems need to change. And when those systems change, then we will be able to create additional spaces and avenues for civic society to bring forth real solutions and real resolve. Thank you.
Thanks. And also, before we move to others, just want to thanks for your invite of solidarity, and remember that today there's an action at 2 p.m. precisely on solidarity with human rights defenders from around the world, through storytellings, poems, and chanting, and solidarity to listen to stories of so many that are facing issues. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wahid. I'm from Transparency International. I'm overseeing Atlas of Corruption and Climate, where a lot of cases related to climate and environment is also embedded with corruption. Of course, that's a problem. But I wanted to kind of like, highlight the importance of, a lot of indigenous community people and also people who are activists who are being killed. I'm monitoring the number of cases, and it's unfortunately to see so many people are being killed because they are protesting the deforestation, for example, or other kind of projects that's being implemented there. But there's less that's being done. I mean, I can understand the way Ahmad explained the activism in his country, but this is apart from that not very political. This is more like on a climate side, but still they're losing their life for for protesting, let's say a deforestation project or any other project on their land. So I think that's important. Maybe we can also bring the attention to that. Thank you.
Yeah, Niti from Climate Action Network, Southeast Asia, and sort of a region with 10 countries which fall under the intergovernmental organization known as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Just to share the experiences that civic space is also increasingly under threat, is getting constrained. And, it ranges, and it's a region which probably under the radar a lot of the time. Yep, in terms of numbers, probably in terms of arrests of environmental defenders, especially those fighting against land grabs, one of the highest numbers in the world, actually. So, and the restriction of civic space, varies from something very subtle, like just questioning a position adopted by the establishment and giving a contrary view, to suddenly not being included in the delegation to COP28. The simplest of things like that, to things which are more extreme, including you know, when youth go and just hold placards saying that we need to declare a climate emergency, and then suddenly being called up for questioning by the authorities, to then the sort of police establishment going and visiting the homes of the youth just to, you know, bring the attention to their parents. And of course, on the extreme end is arrest, detention. And what I'd like to do here is just bring the attention just 2 weeks ago, the arrest of the 5th person in Vietnam, on 5th environmental activist on the accusation of tax evasion. And so there were 4 who were arrested about 1.5 years ago. And we celebrated the release of one of them on the 23rd of May, on the 13th of May, we celebrated one of them who was released after 15 months of a 21-month sentence. At the time she was arrested, she was actually the chair of the board of Climate Action Network Southeast Asia. So we put intense pressure. She was one of 4 arrested on tax evasion at that time, 16 months ago. And we put a lot of pressure. We thought, okay, arrest, maybe the others, it's imminent that the others will also be released. Hasn't been the case. And even one of them has gone on a hunger strike, and so there seems to be no signs. And now on top of everything, what this has created, I mean, when you say tax evasion, all right, then it's suddenly you're arrested and then you go incommunicado. No one knows where you are, your family, no access to lawyers, complete silence. Everyone is, you know, shocked, disturbed, and no idea what's happening. And then suddenly they're brought into court, and then, you know, suddenly they said, okay, you have been imprisoned for 21 months for tax evasion. And now the 5th person just 2 weeks ago, and, you know, the board of Climate Action Network Southeast Asia, at the time of arrest, I said she was our board chair. She was a Goldman Environment Award recipient. You know, and now this person who has been now arrested for tax evasion was a plenary speaker at the Asia Pacific Climate Week. And what all these arrests have done, and I think that's the objection, that's the intention, is that's created this climate of fear, where now Vietnamese civil society organizations don't want to engage, you know, on a regional or international basis. The moment you want, there's so much work to be done in Vietnam. The moment international organizations come to them and say, would you like to work with us? No, thank you. The moment we engage with international organizations, we're under scrutiny and we don't want that. We are really scared. And this lady who was arrested, actually, she was so scared enough, she actually closed the NGO last year. And in spite of that, she's still arrested. And the irony of all of this is the government, with this detention arrest, being seen as a threat to their political security of the establishment, they are the greatest allies the government could have with their net zero emissions 2050 vision, you know, with the need to transition away from the fossil gas and on coal pipelines. These are the greatest assets the establishment could have to help them achieve the vision, and they're going in the wrong direction, and this is a tragedy. And also like to request everyone here to support the campaign to call for the release of Huang Thi Min Hong, who's just a delightful person. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, very inspiring, but also useful to hear the names and the cases of people from around the world from these last 2 interventions. I think we have another one, and then maybe we can go back to the panel.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Cristina Paranti. I'm from the Dutch organization PAX, and I have a question not only about the shrinking civil space at the COP, but about having people who contribute to this shrinking civil space in other countries. And here, of course, I'm talking about the invitation of Assad to Dubai. And basically, my question is, what is your view on how the activists, not only climate activists, but also human rights activists, could react to this in the view of the political landscape in Dubai and the Emirates, but also worldwide? Like, is the boycott a good strategy in your opinion? Is there concerted action, which is the right strategy? So I'll be interested to hear your views on, you know, having people who are really controversial at the climate events like this. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry, maybe just, I see just this last hand here, and then we go back to the panel.
I'll be really quick. I'm Joey Shea from Human Rights Watch, and I have a comment and also a question to Hamid to sort of elucidate on further. There's this question of digital surveillance in the UAE, and I'm wondering if you could speak about sort of the threats to both Emirati activists inside the UAE and climate activists who will be attending. You know, from my understanding, the UAE has sort of great sophistication and has, you know, spent many years purchasing very sophisticated mass surveillance technology and digital targeting technology. So for example, the UAE was one of the first countries that was documented using the NSO's notorious Pegasus spyware, and that was used against very famous Emirati activist Ahmed Mansour, who remains detained. He's been detained in an isolation cell for the past 6 years, and he was able to be targeted because of Pegasus. And so, yeah, I think it's important for climate activists, human rights activists, to be aware of the digital rights threats that are going to be facing them when they arrive in the UAE. From the moment that you step down in the country, they will know who you are, where you are, who you're speaking to. VPNs do not work. Signal, as of now, does not work. Maybe they'll change that during the conference. So I think, you know, particularly for activists from the Global South who are attending, it will be particularly important to consider the sort of digital security threats. The UAE also, you know, shares a lot of data within the Gulf with Saudi Arabia, also with its Western security partners, which aid and are complicit in much of its repression. So yeah, Hamid, potentially could you speak a little bit more about these threats and what folks can do?
Thanks. Yeah, so we have two specific questions to Ahmed, and then we can go to the rest of the panelists in case you want to answer or comment on the rest. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think UAE has, is using very advanced technology and on surveillance, and they do not only attack people or target people inside the UAE, but also outside the UAE. Once you are in UAE, you will be monitored everywhere because there is camera in every single street in the UAE, and they call it the Falcon Eye, and they are using the Falcon Eye. They justify the use of Falcon Eye for criminal purposes, but we know that they are monitoring everyone inside the UAE. So everyone you're gonna meet inside the UAE, will be most likely will be recorded. Maybe within the pavilion of UN, most likely you will have a secure place, but outside, no, you will be targeted. We have some examples here. Joey mentioned the example of Ahmed Mansour. Ahmed Mansour was targeted by NSO, and NSO is very advanced technology. That means they do not need to share a link with you to be hacked. They only need to know your number. So once they know your number, you can be hacked. Yeah, it costs a lot of money, but they're doing it. And not only Ahmed Mansour, even Ala al-Siddiq. Ala al-Siddiq, she, very famous human rights defender. She passed away 2 years ago in London. She was targeted by NSO, and it was documented. Ala was not living inside the UAE when she was targeted. She was living in UK, but they know her number, so they targeted her. Not only Ala. A lot of other people inside the UAE can be monitored with this. Maybe the last thing I would like to mention, there was one prisoner of conscience, his name Osama Najjar. Osama Najjar met a rapporteur inside the UAE. When she visited UAE in 2014, and she was the last rapporteur to visit the UAE, just weeks later, Osama Najjar was detained. So this kind of meeting between Osama Najjar and the rapporteur was monitored by the UAE authority, and Osama Najjar then was detained. Yeah, I think I got my minute, right?
There was also a question on what do we need to do to address situations like the invitation to Assad or other controversial figures. Don't know if you or others want to address that.
Yeah, To address the situation inside the UAE, I think, yeah, I mean, we need to speak up. I mean, we need to speak loud about the situation inside the UAE, within the UAE, because I know that I recently learned that activists who will join the COP28 in UAE, they will enjoy the privilege of immunity from UN. I'm not really sure to what extent, because since the agreement between UAE and the UNFCCC is not public, we cannot guarantee how helpful that immunity will have. However, I mean, within the UAE, within the pavilion, I think if you ask about the resonance of conscience, raise their concern with the delegations, I think most of you from different countries, and most of you have different representative delegations here. Raising these kind of things will be very helpful. The UAE, unfortunately, do not cooperate a lot with the UN mechanism, even though it's one of the UN Human Rights Council, but unfortunately it does not cooperate with them. So when they receive communication from the working groups in UN, like the arbitrary working groups or other rapporteurs, UAE normally do not reply. But maybe within delegations, because this is politics now, I think if delegation raise some concerns with the UAE delegation and inside the UAE, I think that will help opening the civic space inside the UAE, and hopefully will end up releasing the prisoners of conscience.
Thank you. And now maybe, Camilla, do you have any concluding remarks in relation to what we heard or others?
I mean, just speak up, and we need to make a big, loud, collective, strong voice. Thank you.
Thomas?
Just a really quick demonstration of how they want to save their image is in COP27, there is a youth delegation that stood up to contest Biden's speech, and badges were removed and they were not allowed back into COP. And we tried to go through the process of them to receive their badges again, and it wasn't. At COP15 in Montreal the following month, there was a group of indigenous youth that stood up to contest Trudeau's speech, his opening statement, and those youth were they were allowed to say what they had to say. Then they were kicked out of the facility. Their badges weren't removed. We were able to return their badges, but they were surrounded by police with horses. We address these issues because indigenous youth know what is happening on their homelands. They see the destruction foremost, and that they're going to continue to push back and continue to say what needs to be said. And so I hope that we come together and find resolve with this. Thank you.
Thanks. And finally, Catherine.
Well, no, just to say thank you and yeah, in agreement, collective power to resist corporate interests, and just going on to the Pegasus again. That's a private company based in the US, which is an Israeli cyber arm company. So, this is the same surveillance that's used against Palestinian people and to, entrench Israeli apartheid. And that's, again, corporate capture. So yeah, just solidarity and power to everyone on this panel and all the constituencies that you represent. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And so the fight continues, and we can all join forces today in the action and then in the further days that comes and ahead of COP. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
I was enraged in that meeting. Enraged.
They stayed with me. They stayed 15 minutes covering.
I know, like this.
Yeah.
I know, I saw them.
For 15 minutes.
Yeah, gaslighting, victim blaming.
Oh yeah, no. And it was my fault because I didn't go to them and I went to them. No, it was. They went on and on, even worse than what women are doing.
Oh my God.
I
No,
could not believe what they were telling me.
I thought it was very problematic that the chair did not take that into hand, because when a party raises a grievance,